His wife put something in his mother's food. Marcos's voice split the low murmur of the private dining room like a knife. The cutlery paused mid-air. A wine glass wavered. A napkin loosened in someone's lap and drifted to the floor, as if time itself had lost its balance. Isabella saw the scrap first. She was trained to see the small things, the way a napkin folded at the edge of a plate, the microsecond a fork hovers before it descends. That night she'd been clearing a table near the bay window when a white glint slipped from beneath a hand and fluttered into the steaming bowl at the center of the table reserved for Rodrigo's mother. She saw the paper hit the surface, the way it curled and sank at the rim. She saw Marcos, steady, wide-shouldered, lean forward and shout. There was no theatrics in Marcos's shout. It had the economy of someone who had spent years eliminating risk. Simple words, aimed to do one thing: stop the room from moving long enough for evidence to remain where it was. The sound was short and sharp. The consequences unfolded in a series of small, precise gestures. Rodrigo froze with a fork poised between fingers. For one slow, impossible beat, his face did what faces do when the world asks them to choose without warning. It blanked, then tightened. The woman across from him, Valentina, smiled in a way that did not reach her eyes. Donna Carmen, who owned the restaurant and ran it like a small fort, rose without hesitation. Isabella stepped forward, because that was what she had been trained to do: to keep order, to record, to bear witness. Marcos reached the table first. He did not grab the plate or sweep it away. He set a hand gently on the shoulder of Rodrigo's mother, as if steadying her from shock. Then, with practiced hands, he slid a clean napkin around the bowl, folding it and tucking it neatly over the rim. Marcos barked for a pen. Someone handed him a marker. He wrote the time on the napkin, then signed his name on the package, sealing it with the adhesive tape he had brought clipped to his belt. The tape caught the light like a small, official sun. "Don't touch it," he said, and his voice left no room for negotiation. Isabella stepped back, her palms suddenly clammy. Her heartbeat found a rhythm. She watched the scrap of paper trapped beneath the napkin. Her mind began cataloging everything. Who was at the table, where people were sitting, how spoons had been placed. She knew the old rules. Document everything. Photograph the scene. Call the manager. Call the police. Donna Carmen moved into the light without asking. She always did when the restaurant needed steadiness. She had the look of someone who had run 1,000 crises. Quick jaw, no wasted gestures. She instructed one of the servers to take the phones from the nearest guests and place them in a box. "We'll need to preserve anything on camera," she said. She asked Isabella, steady and low, "Were you close enough to see?"
Isabella remembered the physical friction of that white slip sliding over the edge of the table and into the bowl. "Yes," she said, "I saw her drop it." That line, simple, unadorned, brought the room into focus. It was not a plea. It was not a performance. It was an observation that had the force of an inventory. Something happened. Someone noticed. Within minutes, the private dining room had converted into a controlled scene. Staff moved like people who practice routines. Someone locked the door to keep the room contained. Others retrieved an evidence bag, latex gloves, camera. Marcos photographed the table from multiple angles, while Donna Carmen logged the names of everyone present. He and Rodrigo's personal security flagged a member of the kitchen to mark the plates. The napkin was sealed into a tamper-evident envelope with a label that read, "Exhibit A, Plate 1. Marcos wrote the time again, this time on the evidence tag, and handed it to the uniformed police officer who had been summoned at Donna Carmen's urgent call. Isabella gave her statement in the quiet, fluorescent light of the manager's office 2 hours later. She described how Valentina had reached below the table, the angle of her wrist, the briefness of the motion. She repeated the word paper because the specific matter of packaging would matter later. She told Officer Martins the exact second the napkin touched the bowl. She signed the statement, initialed corrections, and watched as the officer placed her form in a clear folder. He explained, gently and plainly, what would happen next. The plate would be sealed and photographed, evidence would be documented, a courier would take it to the municipal forensic laboratory. The plate, wrapped, taped, labeled, would enter a chain of custody that had to be unbroken. Chain of custody, Isabella asked, needing the term to feel real. Officer Martins explained it so she could feel it as a line of hands. Every time that plate changes custody, he said, someone documents who had it, at what time, and how it was sealed. It's how evidence keeps its voice in court. If there's a break, we can't be sure anything we found actually belonged, so we don't let it go unrecorded. The chain in that tiny manager's office became an unspooling of faith, a paper tag, a timestamp, a signature. Isabella watched Marcos place his name and badge of the private security company on the log. She watched the police officer photograph the tape and the tag. The courier signed for the sealed bag at the front door, and everything felt ordinary in the particular way that official processes do. An ordinary scaffolding built to hold extraordinary suspicion. By the time they escorted Rodrigo's mother out of the private room, the story had already leapt out of the woodwork. At the bar, someone had uploaded a shaky clip to a social feed. The first comments were a mix of conjecture and outrage.
A second, more stable video shot by a different guest showed Marcos's hand moving across the table and the paper being trapped under the napkin. A face appeared in the frame, Valentina, smiling in that way people smile when being watched. Isabella felt the swell of the room like a pressure in her ears. Phones were out on every table, cameras angled toward the scene. She noticed, with the stillness of someone cataloging evidence, that social feeds move by rhythm. A clip, a caption, a viral turn. By the time the courier had driven through the city toward the municipal lab, the clip had been shared, comment threads had begun, and a name, Valentina, was typed into search bars by strangers who were already formulating certainty on the basis of a 2-minute video. A reporter came before the lab results did. Adriana's presence felt inevitable. She arrived with the quiet ferocity of someone who had built a career on following threats, small anomalies that led to larger patterns. She asked for the manager, for the statement, for copies of photos. When she watched Isabella describe the scrap and Marcos's seal, Adriana's pen never stopped moving. "If anything else happens," she said, "call me." The story started to breathe outside the scene. Clips sprout along feeds. Some voices insisted on waiting for lab confirmation. Others declared the guilt of Valentina with the absolute certainties of those who had never had to hold evidence. The restaurant's PR person, pulled from a list of people who manage crises as if they were logistics, drafted a short, careful release. An incident occurred in a private dining room this evening. Authorities are investigating. No further comment pending official results. The sentence was neutral. The world read it as a place to stand and judge. Within 24 hours, the legal mechanics of power began to show themselves. Valentina did not wait. Her lawyer, efficient and practiced, sent a terse letter to the restaurant and to the police via email, a defamation notice demanding that any public allegations naming Valentina be withdrawn and that any posts suggesting criminal conduct be taken down. It was not an unusual tactic. It was procedural pressure performed with the clinical distance of someone who had replicated the move many times. The letter threatened civil action if Isabella's name or the footage continued to circulate. At the same time, an envelope arrived at the restaurant for Isabella, unmarked, sealed, containing bills folded precisely with a small typed note. "A gesture for your trouble. No need to involve yourself further." Isabella stared at the bills until the paper blurred. Money, offered quietly, with a thin apology, was an old currency in the new trouble of the night. She folded the note into her palm and placed it in a drawer, then photographed it. She texted a single line to Donna Carmen. "Someone left an envelope for me." Carmen's reply was immediate and short. "Keep it. Call Officer Martins."
It was the pattern Isabella had seen in other stories. Money offered to close conversations, lawyers drafted to intimidate, the social pulse pushing to decide guilt or innocence before a lab had the chance to speak. Each of those moves was not itself decisive evidence of a crime, but together they form the familiar silhouette of power exercising pressure. On the third morning, the lab called. "Preliminary toxicology suggests presence of a sedative compound," the analyst said, careful to keep each word measured. "It's preliminary. We'll run confirmatory tests. That could take 24 to 72 hours, depending on our cue and whether we require reference standards." That phrase, preliminary, was not a verdict. It was the lab's way of avoiding certainty while giving direction. The lab told Officer Martins that the plate's outer packaging was intact when it arrived. It had the same seal and the same hand-signed tag documented at the restaurant. The chain of custody in the file was, for the moment, unbroken. Rodrigo sat in the small office outside the lab corridor with his hands clasped as if he could hold his decisions in place. He had a fortune that kept many things comfortable, but at that moment, the thing he looked at was not the bank balance. It was his mother's face, fragile, suddenly slumping into a kind of slow confusion that had alerted Marcos in the dining room. There was a private arithmetic in his chest, loyalty to family, the gravitational pull to protect the one he loved, versus a recognition that truth had to be found if harm had been intended.
He could, at that point, have asked for discretion and attempted to handle the matter inside his own circles. He could also let the process run its official course. The choice was not heroic. It was practical. It was a decision that would mark every subsequent move. He chose the process. "I want everything done through the proper channels," he said to Officer Martins, and the sentence landed steady. It was not a moral pronouncement. It was an operational one. Even with the lab's measured language, rumor found purchase. The preliminary result became a headline on a local feed. "Sedative found in plate at high-profile dinner, lab says." The headline did the job of a lens. It refracted the nuance into something harder, simpler. People chose sides in comments and shares. Valentina's lawyer pushed back publicly, calling the story reckless and demanding immediate retraction of any accusations. Valentina herself posted an image of the dinner room with a smiling filter and a caption about invasive rumors. The posts were polished. The hashtag threads swelled with people repeating fragments and inventing motives. Isabella found she was suddenly the center of attention in a way she had never wanted. Her social handles were searched. Commenters speculated about her background, and some outlets hinted at an ulterior motive. Why would a waitress risk accusing a woman like Valentina?
The implication, thin and precise, was that Isabella sought attention, or money, or both. The implication was also a legal tactic: attack the witness to deflate the accusation. The defense's operation in public comment threads could be aggressive. Its aim was to sow doubt long before a jury could weigh facts. Donna Carmen held a meeting with her staff. She spoke in the blunt language of managers. "You do not engage with comments," she instructed. "If anyone calls, give them Adriana's contact. If anyone offers you money, photograph it and call me. Don't delete anything, preserve it." Her focus was on process as protection: records, screenshots, receipts, witness statements. She made a copy of every phone that had recorded the evening. Each one was logged and stored in a safe. Adriana dug into Valentina's past with a slow, patient focus. Her first pass turned up small things: shell companies that had changed names, a series of business filings in different states with similar addresses, and a pattern of rapid relocations that suggested someone purposely moved identities like chess pieces across a board. Adriana's job was to connect the tiny dots: transaction ledgers, phone metadata, a payment to a boutique PR firm, until a pattern looked like a path. But everything Adriana turned over was, for the moment, circumstantial. There were suspicious transfers, to be sure, but no clean line that said motive with the brute force of proof. Those details would matter later, because they could reveal a habit of erasing tracks, of substituting corporate shells for direct accountability. For now, they were leads, which meant someone would have to subpoena records to prove what curious accounting could only suggest. Meanwhile, Isabella began to feel the cost of being the one who had seen. The envelope that had arrived at the restaurant was not the only thing. Anonymous messages started to appear: a text with a photograph of a street near her apartment, a voicemail with silence breathing through the static, a direct message with the words, calculated, impersonal, "Keep your mouth shut." There were also offers that masqueraded as concern: a man's call asking if she'd accept a small payment for her trouble, with the soft framing of a friend offering help. Each time, Isabella took the same action. She photographed the message, she saved the voicemail, she forwarded it to Officer Martins. The police logged each instance into the file. The pattern of pressure was not new. It was simply another language of influence. Money waved like a bandage, threats posed like business decisions. The simple action of documenting turned such gestures from immediate intimidation into records that could be used. Documentation was, in this case, a form of defense. It converted ephemeral coercion into traceable events. On the fifth day, the lab sent a follow-up message. Confirmatory tests were underway, and serum from Rodrigo's mother had been drawn and sent for analysis as well. Officer Martins explained, gently, that blood work could corroborate timing. If the presence of the compound showed up in the mother's blood at levels consistent with recent ingestion, it would strengthen the connection between the paper in the plate and her symptoms. It still wouldn't be a narrative of motive or intent. The lab could say what a sample contained, but not why someone had placed it there. But it would, at least, hand facts to the investigators. Valentina's team responded by tightening public posture. Her PR firm released a statement about privacy and presumption of innocence, and her lawyer filed a formal notice warning news outlets against defamation. The document read like a protective shield. It did not deny the question directly.
It demanded silence and retraction as preventive measures. The legal tactic was precise: bog down the accusers in the slow mechanics of civil law so that the chaotic speed of public opinion would have to slow to a legal crawl. Donna Carmen refused to be bullied into secrecy. She gave Adriana the copies of the footage, and then she allowed the restaurant to be named in pieces Adriana was preparing. The restaurant had a lot to lose: licenses, clientele, reputation, but it also had a duty, in Carmen's view, to not let the consumable world become the place where wrongdoing was normalized. Her stance carried consequence. It invited scrutiny of the restaurant as much as it did of the accused. Isabella began to sleep in short, punctured stretches. She ate less. The excitement of the first night receded into a prudential weariness. Friends in the staff offered what comfort they could. Some suggested a public statement. Others said silence was wiser. Officer Martins told her to alert him if she felt at risk. Adriana offered to put her in touch with a journalist who had experience protecting whistleblowers onto eddies when necessary. Rodrigo called her twice, once with a voice that sounded like he had been awake for hours, and once to thank her simply for telling the truth. His thanks felt like a bandage. It was not power in the abstract. It was an acknowledgement that he had seen her act and that it had mattered. On the morning the preliminary lab result arrived in the public feed, Isabella walked past a newsstand to find a photograph of herself as an illustration to an opinion piece. The picture had been taken without permission from a private feed. The caption reduced her to a symbol. She felt something hollow open inside, an embarrassment that was also a small, fierce anger. She had not been seeking attention. She had been doing the work the room had needed. The confirmatory tests, the blood work, the subpoenas, those were the parts of the story that would require time and patience. For now, the legal world had begun to assemble. The police file thickened. The defense assembled its letters. Valentina's network stood by her. The public, hungry for certainty, tried to name guilt into existence.
Isabella kept doing the small, invisible things that mattered to a case. She preserved messages, she met with officers, she kept to the schedule of being available for interviews with the prosecutor. One evening, when she was locking up after a late shift, a courier handed her a plain envelope stamped with a return address she did not recognize. There was no cash inside this time. Instead, there was a single photograph, a picture of the restaurant's back alley at midnight. The wide, empty space and a stamped time, taken on a night when several staff had been closing, was the photograph itself. On the back, in a handwriting not unlike a loop of muscle memory fashioned to intimidate, were the words, "You saw. Remember that." Isabella put the photograph in the same drawer she kept the other messages. She called Officer Martins. He asked her if she wanted the police to collect the item. She said yes. He said he would. She felt no immediate fear for her life. She felt the neat, small terror of being made aware that someone could watch the outlines of her days. She had noticed, acted, and now the world had shown her that actions have consequences. That night, as she sat at her small kitchen table under the thin light of a single bulb, she thought of the scrap of paper falling into a plate and how little the event had looked at first. It had looked like a simple motion. It had been nothing more, and then it had been everything. She traced the rim of a coffee cup with her finger. The house hummed with the usual city sounds, the distant clack of tires, a dog barking 2 blocks away. The city did not stop because a private dinner became a public case, but her life had shifted into a new geometry of attention. The lab called again in the afternoon. "Confirmatory testing is not yet complete," the analyst said. "We're running the reference standards. We should have results within the 72-hour window we discussed." The words were careful, but there was a note now, a gravity that had not been there on day one. The police had logged the money, the envelopes, the threats. A prosecutor had taken interest and asked to see the file. Subpoenas were drafted for phone records. Adriana had found an assistant at Valentina's company who said off the record that Valentina had been unusually anxious in recent months and had increased payments to a security detail. That was not evidence of a crime, but it was a lead. The story had crested into multiple channels: an official investigation, a public argument, and private pressures. Isabella felt at once the burden of bearing witness and the relief of being believed by the people whose work mattered: Donna Carmen, Officer Martins, Adriana, and a small cluster of co-workers who had helped preserve footage. These were modest scaffolds, but they were real. Late that same afternoon, a taller, heavier envelope than the others arrived at the restaurant for Rodrigo.
No one was meant to open such things alone in the middle of a public place, But Rodrigo, who had come in to pick up his mother from a checkup and to talk to the police, took the envelope to a private room. He opened it with the guarded curiosity of someone who suspected every gift might hold a calculus. Inside, folded and neat, were bank slips and a short note. To make this quiet. There was no signature. Rodrigo read the words, then read them again, feeling something small and bitter like a stone sit in his chest. He called Marcos and said one sentence, "Document everything." When Rodrigo handed the slips to Officer Martins, the officer explained plainly what would happen next. They would photograph, log, and secure the envelope as potential evidence of attempted witness tampering. The prosecutor, alerted, would likely issue subpoenas to trace the source of the funds. Money offered to silence a witness is not simply a bribe in the moral sense. In legal terms, it becomes a potential obstruction and an element of the case to be examined for motive. If a defense suggested Isabella had accepted money, the investigation could show the envelope was unsolicited. Legal truth is often hammered out through these carefully gathered fragments. The week closed with the lab's machines still humming. Confirmatory tests were underway, and the prosecutor asked for patience. The public, as always, did not want patience. It wanted clear answers. Valentina's tone hardened in public statements. Her legal team filed an injunction to remove certain clips on social platforms. The feeds resisted. Adriana filed requests for records. The restaurant posted signage about ongoing cooperation with authorities and asked for privacy. And through it all, Isabella kept the habit that had started the case. She noticed. She documented. She called. When someone approached her in the market and asked if she would consider a payment to leave town quietly, she photographed the man's license plate and reported him. When the defamation notice arrived with the lawyer's carefully calibrated threats, she sent it to Officer Martins and printed a hard copy into the police file. She kept a folder at home in which she placed every physical note, every screenshot, every photograph. The folder was heavy with small moments that might one day be assembled into a sequence strong enough to speak in court. On a rain-softened morning, while officers were still waiting on the lab's final report, a new line of complication appeared in the police logs. A routine check on surveillance footage from the valet garage near Valentina's building suggested a late-night departure matching her car's plate, a departure that, in the timing of the night in question, placed her near the route the courier would have taken if someone had handed over a package. The details were thin: early metadata, partial license recognition.
It was not a conclusive piece. It was a hint that required subpoena power and a careful hand. Adriana watched the pattern unfold with the trained patience of a reporter who knows how slowly law moves, yet how decisively evidence can accumulate. She took her findings to a colleague who specialized in public records and asked for help to verify ownership of the vehicle and payments for the valet. The two of them made calls and sent emailed requests to municipal departments that would return, in time, the kind of public records that take the shape of fact. For Isabella, the political complexity of power was no longer theoretical. It had edge and teeth. The defense's public strategy attempted to collapse motive into suspicion. Was she angry, vindictive, seeking fame? Some commentators, emboldened by the rumor mill, suggested she might be the novel kind of attention seeker who manufactures crisis to become a story. Those voices were loud enough to bruise, but not to erase the recorded facts: a paper, a seal, a timestamp, a statement signed under oath. On the 8th day, the lab called with a different tone. "We have preliminary confirmation that there is a sedative compound consistent with the screening results," the analyst said. "The quantitative levels in the match to reference standards are pending, but the initial confirmatory assay aligns with the screening." The sentence held the careful science tone the lab had used since the start. It was not a full declaration of the crime, but it was the first time the lab's language had leaned toward affirmation. At the restaurant, the call landed like the first hard rain of the season. The evidence bag had carried a quiet authority. The world folded into a new set of possibilities. Rodrigo's relief at having the investigation proceed through official channels was tempered by the knowledge that confirming the sedative was only the beginning. Motive, intent, and the investigation of who had access to that scrap of paper would take months and possibly years. Meanwhile, the defense continued to sow doubt, and the PR machinery continued to redirect the public gaze.
Isabella took a breath and said the thing she had told herself she would say if clarity came. "Everything I saw, I recorded. I saved every message." Her voice was not triumphant, it was precise. It sounded to the people listening like the sound of someone who had decided to keep counting. And yet the work had not ended. The envelope on the restaurant counter, the bank slips, the photograph in the drawer, each new item was a turn in the larger machinery of the case. The lab's preliminary confirmation meant only that the investigation would now allocate more resources, that subpoenas would go out, that phone records would be mined. The defense would sharpen its public campaign in response. Valentina's pockets were deep. The legal tactics available to her were numerous and familiar.
The story had entered the slow, grinding world where power meets procedure. That was when the first real escalation came. A courier, acting on a tip that would later prove to be partial and panicked, reported a sighting of a vehicle that may have been used by someone connected to Valentina, leaving the city on an early morning. It was not the kind of solid lead that guaranteed anything. It was, at first, a worry, a bell rung by someone who wanted to help, but whose vision had been blurred by haste. The police took it seriously. They put in a request for travel records and for CCTV pulls along possible routes. It required coordination between municipal departments and regional transportation agencies. It required time. Time, in this case, worked along two axes. The lab needed it to finish assays. The police needed it to piece together movements. In the meantime, the public narrative continued to operate at the speed of outrage and speculation. Isabella, as the central human element in the chain, found herself living at the intersection of two different temporalities: the slow, legal one, the chain of custody, the lab assays, the subpoenas, and the fast, social one, the posts, the claims, the rage. Her folder of documentation accumulated. Her nights were shorter. Adrian's messages arrived more frequently. Rodrigo called more often, each time with a different small version of gratitude and a tiredness that made the world feel thin. Then, on a thunder-soft night, Isabella's phone buzzed with a news alert. The caption read that police were investigating a possible flight from the city by someone close to Valentina. It was a speculation at that point, based on a CCTV poll and a call tip. Officer Martins texted her, "Stay put. We will keep you informed. Do not engage with anyone from the press without a lawyer." She put the phone down and stared at the street through her kitchen window. The light from the news ticker flickered across the room. Outside, the city lived its small, unmoved life. Beyond the big machinery of labs and cicadas, there was a human life being rearranged into patterns of vigilance. Shorter walks, changing routes, door locks double-checked. She found herself practicing the same small acts she had performed in the manager's office, the work of documentation, the collection of proof. Not long after, a detective called and asked if she would be willing to go back over her testimony in a recorded interview. She agreed. She sat at the table with her printed folder, with the voice recorder on the table between her and the officer. She answered the same questions she had answered before, but this time the answers were recorded for the prosecutor's file, to be used in potential court testimony. When she closed the interview and walked back into the damp evening, she felt a curious kind of exhaustion, the knowledge that her voice might be the one the court would rely on, the private sense of being both protected and exposed.
She walked home with her shoulders slightly forward, the posture of someone who had been set out and found to be useful. At the end of that week, the preliminary confirmatory note from the lab arrived in the police inbox. Preliminary confirmation that the plate contained a sedative compound. Blood work drawn from Rodrigo's mother had detectable levels consistent with the ingestion window. The lab still awaited final quantification and documentation, but the file had changed. The evidence, carefully sealed, logged, transported, and analyzed, now spoke in a clearer register. The chain of custody had held. When Officer Martins told her what the lab had said, Isabella felt something like a lowering of pressure in her chest, and simultaneously the thickening of the road ahead. The science had not yet answered why or how. It had only affirmed that the plate contained a compound consistent with causing the symptoms his mother had shown. The rest, the motive, the access, the intention, remained to be proven in the slow, exacting way that criminal process demands. Outside, social feeds hummed with reactions. Valentina's team accused the media of rushing to judgment. Valentina herself, who had taken to posting staged images of charity nights and quotes about privacy, increased the intensity of her legal push. The defamation notices multiplied. A delivery of legal paperwork arrived at the restaurant, demanding that all footage be turned over to a named law firm,
and attempt, again, at control. Isabella, who had begun this because she had seen a movement and named it aloud, liked to think of herself as someone who performed small acts of clarity. She was not a crusader. She was a woman who had done what she felt the room required. She had recorded, she had preserved, she had called for help. The world had responded with law, with science, with money, and with pressure. And there, in the middle of the machine, was a simple, stubborn fact. Someone had dropped a small scrap of paper into a plate, something had been sealed and analyzed, and the machine of justice was turning toward the question of responsibility. For Isabella, the choice was already made. She would not let the small private truth of what she had seen be compressed into gossip, nor would she let it be bought away in an envelope. She had decided to keep counting. But decisions have consequences. The legal mechanics that would follow, the subpoenas for phone metadata, the depositions of witnesses, the eventual plea or indictment, were still ahead. The social machinery continued to thrash, with posts and counterposts, and the occasional line of cruelty from someone who found their place in a thread by proclaiming certainty. And then, on a gray afternoon when the lab's final numbers were still pending, Isabella received a single voicemail from an unknown number. The voice was low and practiced. "You might want to think about what's next," it said, and then hung up. Isabella did not panic.
She documented the call, forwarded it to Officer Martins, and sat with the silence afterward. She made tea. She opened the drawer that held the photograph of the alley and the envelopes and the notes, and placed a fresh sheet of paper on top. She wrote, in block letters, the names of everyone who had been at the table. She dated it. She signed it. The plate remained sealed in evidence storage. The napkin's creases and the faint stain of broth were there on the photograph in the police file. The lab machines hummed. Rodrigo's hands unclasped and closed around the phone. Valentina's feeds polished their messages. Adriana kept digging through corporate filings. Donas Carmen's restaurant continued to cook meals for people who walked in and had no idea how close their plates might come, on a different night, to becoming evidence. Isabella turned off her light and found herself replaying one small detail from the evening, the way the paper had shuddered on the rim of the bowl, as if it had been resisting something. She had not known then that it would become a hinge for a story that would stretch beyond a single room. Now, with evidence moving towards confirmation, and with pressure mounting from both sides, she understood that the smallest things sometimes required the most courage to name. Her phone buzzed again. Another message. This time it was from Adriana. "We've got a lead on a payments trail. Meet me at the cafe on 3rd in 30 minutes. Come safe." Isabella looked at the folder, at the sealed envelope she'd been saving as if it were a small altar of truth. She tucked it under her arm and went out into the rain, the file heavy, and the city indifferent, and the sense of being a witness becoming, for better or worse, the axis on which the next days would spin. They met under the awning of a small cafe on 3rd, the rain thinning to a fine mist that left the sidewalks glistening. Adriana arrived first, hands wrapped around a paper cup as if the heat steadied her. She folded into the booth with the economy of someone who had learned to keep notes in their head as insurance. Isabella set the police folder on the table between them, the edges of paper visible like a modest private map. "Payments trail," Adriana said without preface. She slid a printed ledger across the table. Tiny numbers and dates marched in columns. Routing numbers blinked like ordnance. "I pulled a few filings," she continued. "There are transfers, small at first, then larger, into an account that ties back to a shell company Valentina once controlled. The pattern looks like retainer payments, security fees, and then a lump sum dated 2 days before the dinner." Her voice was steady but quick. It was not accusation, it was inventory. Isabella read the numbers with the same kind of precision she used at a table, a tilt to the paper, the precise edge of a margin. "You can get a subpoena to those bank records?" she asked. Adriana nodded. "Already talked to the prosecutor."
"They've ordered preservation notices. If Valentina tries to move funds, that will show up. We need the chain of transfers, where the money landed and who signed for it." They divided tasks the way people who had to do actual work did. Adriana would keep digging into corporate filings and PR invoices. Isabella would meet the prosecutor to go over the folder and testify to everything she had preserved. Officer Martins would work with the forensic team to confirm timelines. They left the cafe with different parts of the same story in their pockets. The investigation moved into that slow, bureaucratic rhythm that feels much louder to the people at its center. Subpoenas went out. Records arrived in encrypted files. The lab sent a formal report to the police. Preliminary confirmatory results that corroborated the presence of a sedative compound in the sample collected from the plate, and detectable levels in the serum drawn from Rodrigo's mother, consistent with the timing of the dinner. The report was careful, the kind of careful that reads like someone setting a bridge into place. Measurements, error margins, signatures. It was enough to keep the prosecutor interested. With evidence accumulating, the prosecutor authorized more intrusive steps. Phone records were subpoenaed. Valentina's inbound and outbound calls, text metadata, and location pings became part of the dossier. The defense pushed back, filing motions to quash certain requests on privacy grounds. The legal contest was as much about the shape of the file as it was about the facts inside it. Each motion required a counter. Each counter required documentation. The case was beginning to look like a machine whose gears were legal briefs. Adriana found a witness who would prove crucial. A junior assistant at Valentina's communications firm, a woman who had been with the company for less than a year, had grown uneasy as she watched invoices dressed as event coordination suddenly shift into categories called logistics and personal security. She hadn't thought much of it until she saw a wire routing that matched a pattern Adriana had already flagged. She agreed to speak off the record, and then, when given assurances by the prosecutor, she agreed to testify under subpoena. Her testimony was not dramatic. It was a series of small bureaucratic facts: an email thread with invoices, a name on a bank transfer, the forwarding address for a courier. Those small facts multiplied. One acknowledged payment followed another, until the pattern formed an architecture. Someone had paid for services that could be described as security and logistics, and in the days before the dinner, a substantial transfer left an account linked to Valentina's network and routed through intermediary accounts commonly used to obscure origin. Defense counsel pivoted.
If the prosecution would try to make a motive out of money flows, then defense counsel tried to diffuse motive by arguing coincidence, sloppy bookkeeping, and legitimate expenditures. In depositions, defense attorneys invited witnesses to speculate. They suggested that payments could be about real estate deals, charity events, or upgraded insurance premiums. The courtroom strategy was familiar: turn a needle into cotton until people could no longer feel its point. Meanwhile, the social atmosphere outside legal filings grew rawer. Online comment threads hardened into camps. Some voices celebrated Isabella as a hero. Others whispered she had manufactured an incident for gain. There were the predictable private threats, messages left in anonymous accounts, veiled warnings from people who may have been doing a client's bidding. The police logged each one. The prosecutor's office began building a witness protection plan, not because they expected the worst necessarily, but because prudent procedure requires it when someone central to a case receives attention and intimidation. Isabella lost shifts. Regular bookings at the restaurant shrank, as some patrons felt the place had become inconveniently public. For a woman whose paychecks depended on tips and hours under warm light, the economic pinch was real. She took what odd job she could: a weekday breakfast shift here, a private catering job there. Friends from the staff pooled what they could to help. Donna Carmen quietly covered a few of Isabella's bills. The gesture was simple and uncompensated, and to Isabella it felt like the most generous thing in the world. Then, on an ordinary early morning, when the streets had not yet filled, the case escalated in the way police novels usually say for climaxes. A transport van carrying Valentina, en route between a custody hearing and a pretrial detention center, never reached its destination intact. Surveillance footage from a stretch of highway showed a van pulling into a service plaza. Some footage suggested a door had been opened. A woman in a service uniform had approached, and in the confusion, someone had exited the van briefly, and then, in a way that would later be described in court as aided by external assistance, left the area in a different vehicle. The news alert that evening said simply, and without the nuance the investigators felt, that Valentina had fled custody. Social comments multiplied, as if they could stitch intent to the act. For the investigation, it meant more than a headline. The escape required an urgent manhunt. Local, then regional law enforcement units were mobilized. Interagency communications lit up. Travel records were pulled. CCTV across airports and highways were requested. The prosecutor immediately sought additional charges: obstruction, escape, possible conspiracy charges if evidence suggested coordination. It took less than 3 days for the net to close.
A tip to a hotel manager in a coastal town, someone who had recognized Valentina from coverage, led to a rapid, careful arrest. She was taken into custody without incident. The recapture added layers to the case. At first, it seemed like a simple sequence: flight, manhunt, recapture. But investigators found small inconsistencies in the transportation logs, and an internal review uncovered that a guard on the original transport had taken an unauthorized break, and that a subcontracted driver had accepted a private call the night before. Those discoveries led to internal discipline and a little public embarrassment. They also gave the prosecution reason to allege that the escape had been facilitated, adding obstruction to the list of charges. The escape and recapture hardened public opinion. People who had been sitting on the fence found positions. The defense argued that the escape was a sensationalized anecdote, an event that revealed nothing about guilt. The prosecution argued it was a piece of the puzzle that showed consciousness of guilt and a willingness to avoid accountability. The court docket filled with additional motions. The judge, in a hearing that required patience rather than drama, set trial dates and managed a long calendar of witness lists, protective orders, and sequestration considerations. Preparations for trial turned the case into a different kind of machinery. The prosecutor organized exhibits, a photograph of the sealed plate, the evidence tag with Marcus's signature, the lab reports with their preliminary confirmatory language, the bank transfer copies, courier receipts, the annotated phone metadata. Each item had been carefully logged, and the chain of custody, Marcus, the responding officer, the courier, the lab technician, was a timeline of named hands. That chain would be the spine of the prosecution's case. Small, discrete transfers of responsibility that together ensured the item in court was the exact item taken from the dinner table. The defense, bluntly, looked for fault lines. Defense attorneys filed motions attacking the integrity of the chain of custody, suggesting that a break could have occurred during storage at the municipal evidence locker or during transfer to the lab. The prosecutor anticipated this and called witnesses to explain protocols. The log-in sheet at the evidence storage, the photograph of tape on the envelope when it arrived at the lab, the signature pages secured by the courier. The chain proved durable under cross-examination because the participants had, in that crucial hour, acted with careful, observable gestures. Marcus sealing the bag and photographing it. Officer Martins logging timestamps and badges. The courier's signature at the station. The record assembled as a series of small official acts held. When jury selection arrived, it felt, to everyone who had watched the case from a distance, more like theater than law.
In reality, it was boring, procedural work. Questionnaires, challenge strikes, a judge quietly instructing on the law. Prospective jurors hesitated in the same ways that citizens do when asked to promise impartiality in a world that lives on fast opinions. In the end, a jury of 12 was sworn. The trial opened with the prosecutor laying out the narrative in plain terms: a high-profile private dinner, a napkin and a scrap of paper, a seal and an evidence bag, a lab's confirmatory report, the phone records and payments that suggested a web of logistics. The prosecutor did not dramatize. He placed pieces in order, like someone setting tiles into a pattern. The defense's opening was narrower, emphasizing possibility over proof. There was uncertainty in the lab, they said. There were other people at the dinner, and motive required proof beyond suspicion. Witnesses were called in a measured cadence. Marcos described his training, his actions that night, and the specifics of sealing the plate. He explained their writing on the evidence had the 2-hour window, the controls run alongside the sample, and the documentation chain. All of it was technical, and it was delivered in plain language that jurors could grasp. Isabella's testimony was quieter than the headlines had suggested it would be. She sat in the witness box and answered questions in short, specific sentences. She described reaching behind the table and seeing emotion, the white scrap, the way it landed, the angle of the wrist. She described the sealing, Marcos folding a napkin, the tape binding it, the tag with a time written in bold marker. She described what she had done afterward, photographs, messages, the envelope that had arrived, and how she had preserved it. On cross-examination, the defense tried to poke holes. They suggested she had not been paying attention, that she had been in a rush, that the lighting had been poor. They asked if she had ever sought publicity before, if she had ever filed complaints about patrons, if her memory could be colored by the attention. She answered each question with the same small precision she used at the table. "I wrote what I saw," she said. "I photographed what I was given. I kept copies of the messages and gave them to the police." Her voice did not tremble. It did not need to. Surveillance footage was played, a short clip showing Valentina's hand brushing beneath the table, a scrap scene in motion. The prosecution showed the invoice transfers, and the assistant from Valentina's firm explained how a particular sequence of payments was inconsistent with ordinary expenses. Courier receipts matched the timing. The jury saw pages of paperwork and listened as the prosecutor connected them. Payments to a network, invoices for logistics, a courier route timed with the dinner, a sealed plate analyzed in the lab. The defense argued possibility. Someone else could have had access to the plate. Someone else could have arranged payments for legitimate services. The chain could have been broken. The press had rushed to judgment. The defense's witness called into question some details, suggesting that memory is fallible, and that people who had seen something might have since been influenced. But those were counsel's arguments, and the jury had other things before them: the recorded lab results, a signed evidence log, a consistent witness statement made early and again under oath, and financial transfers that, even if they did not state intent, formed a background against which motive could be inferred. Near the trial's midpoint, a new complication arrived: anonymous harassment of jurors. A juror reported seeing an inflammatory social post that referenced the case and suggested a bias. The judge moved quickly, admonished the public, and tightened instructions. The court recessed for a day as the clerk reviewed juror safety procedures. It was a reminder that trials do not occur in a vacuum, and that public attention has real-world effects on the people asked to decide guilt or innocence. In the final days of testimony, the prosecutor called a forensic expert to explain blood work results in plain language. The expert described pharmacokinetics, how a sedative compound might appear in serum, and how timing of ingestion could be suggested by concentration levels. The testimony allowed the jury to understand, in concrete terms, why parallel positive findings in plate residue and serum mattered. They established a contemporaneous link rather than an unrelated presence. The expert guarded against the temptation to pronounce motive. Science could not reach across intention. It could only describe presence, concentration, and timing. Valentina took the stand in her defense. Her testimony was measured and poised. She described herself as a woman who had led philanthropic work and who had been swept into a maelstrom of online vilification. The defense painted the accusations as an attack she had not anticipated, a high-profile smear. She denied involvement. Her demeanor was calm. Her lawyers sought to redirect sympathy toward their client and doubt toward the evidence. The defense's closing argument asked the jury to find reasonable doubt. The prosecution's closing summed the case into small, irrefutable acts: a scrap seen falling into a plate, a seal recorded and transported, confirmatory lab results linking plate residue and blood serum, payments and logistics that, while not a confession, created context. The prosecutor asked the jury to see the weight of the assembled items and to find that the prosecution had met the burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt.
The deliberation was a quiet, private business of 12 people. They returned with a verdict late in the afternoon. The foreperson's voice, when the clerk called them, was low with the gravity the system reserves for such moments. Guilty on counts of attempted poisoning and related fraud charges. There were tears at the back of the courtroom from family members. Valentina sank into the bench, her face a landscape of shock and calculation. When the gavel fell on the verdict, the sense of legal accountability was palpable but incomplete. Appeals would be filed, motions would be argued, and the sentence would be negotiated in a later hearing. The jury had done what the system asked them to do: weigh evidence and render judgment according to law. For Isabella, for Marcos, and for the restaurant staff who had documented their actions, the verdict meant the case had been adjudicated by the community's chosen instruments of law, not by rumor, social posts, or envelopes at the door. But the cost of stepping into the middle of such a public case did not evaporate with a verdict. Isabella continued to be monitored by trolls and occasionally found herself recognized in public. Some shifts at the restaurant could not be replaced. She had to take days off around court dates and discovered employers and managers sometimes prefer the quiet of a staff that does not make headlines. The financial strain did not disappear overnight. She accepted a small grant organized by local supporters that helped cover bills for several months, and Adriana organized a community fundraiser that brought in donations and a steady, practical attention to the restaurant staff needs. Institutional responses followed, modest but real. Donna Carmen instituted a new protocol for staff safety and evidence preservation, anonymized checklists, locked camera storage, and a standard operating procedure to hand off potential evidence to police. The restaurant partnered with a local nonprofit to train staff on digital safety, how to preserve phone footage, and measures to take if they encountered intimidation. The prosecutor's office issued a bulletin to other municipal departments recommending similar protocols for businesses that might unexpectedly become sites of criminal activity, how to preserve evidence, how to secure footage, and how to support staff. Isabella, who had never wanted to be a public figure or advocate, found doors opening. A small local foundation that partnered with prosecutors working on witness protection offered an administrative role coordinating training sessions for hospitality venues. They wanted someone who had done the work and could explain, in precise practical terms, how to notice, how to document, and how to call for help. The offer was not glamorous. It paid a wage that replaced her lost shifts, and it allowed her to remain in a field she knew. It was also an opportunity to translate the strain she had endured into something practical for other people.
She accepted. Her new role was not about lectures. It was about checklists and binders, about running training sessions for restaurant staff on chain of custody basics, on how to keep phones secure, how to photograph and timestamp evidence, and when to call police. The work felt like making sure fragile ladders were anchored. It was administrative, sober, and necessary. There were private costs she carried that no job could erase. The envelopes and the photographs that had arrived at her door had left a residue. She started therapy to manage the strain, an arrangement paid for initially through the community fundraiser. Therapy did not promise to remove memory. It offered a way to live with it. Nightmares gave way to less frequent wakes. Friends came with dinners and plain conversation. Someone gifted her gardening tools, and she began, tentatively, to grow basil on a windowsill. The small domestic acts, watering leaves, tying up a stray stem, felt like stitches. Rodrigo's mother recovered, slowly and with some unevenness. The sedative's effects were not permanent, the doctor said, but the episode had revealed vascular fragility she had not known about. She spent time with a rehabilitation program and with family visits that had a new urgency.
Rodrigo visited more often, scheduling time in his day as if the hours had become precious and fragile. He remained publicly composed, privately grateful, and quietly attentive to Isabella in small ways, a note, an offer to cover bills, that she refused with a folded, practical explanation that she had accepted other institutional support. At a small gathering months after the verdict, Rodrigo brought a pie to the restaurant, a simple gesture that carried the weight of thanks without turning it into spectacle. Valentina filed appeals. They were expected and routine. Her legal team challenged evidence, argued procedural errors, and attempted to keep the case moving through the appellate pipeline. Appeals did not erase the trial's impact, but they delayed finality. For Isabella, the appeals were a sour, long hum. She kept the folder in a drawer and checked her phone less often. There were also legal reverberations. The guard involved in the transport that had allowed Valentina's escape faced internal discipline and later charges for violating protocols. An internal review of contracted transport services led to policy changes and tighter oversight. The municipal evidence storage underwent a chain of custody audit. None of these changes were generous. They were necessary corrections that kept the machinery of public safety from failing in the same way again. As the immediate legal calendar rounded towards closure, the modest foundation that had offered Isabella a job asked if she would help build a practical training module aimed at hospitality workers. They wanted something lean: how to notice, how to document, and how to call for help.
Isabella's voice in the early drafts was blunt and simple. Notice the small things, photograph them, log names and times, and hand them over to police. The training included mock scenarios and checklists, and a hotline number the foundation maintained for urgent consultation. The module was delivered to several hotels and restaurants. People who walked in with skeptical faces left with notebooks. The training did not make people heroic, it made them procedural. It taught that courage was not a performance, but a decision to do the small, concrete tasks that allowed evidence to keep its voice. When the verdict was appealed, when the sentence was set in a later hearing, the system continued to wind through its motions. The appeals process took its time. For the community, the major prosecutorial win remained the jury verdict itself, the determination that, on the evidence presented, a crime had been committed, and that the social order had mechanisms to prosecute it. Months after the verdict, with the appeals still proceeding through the usual stages, Isabella found herself at a small community fair where Dona Carmen's bakery had set up a tent. The event was modest: children spinning on a borrowed carousel, neighbors bringing baked goods, and a small table where the foundation offered pamphlets and a hotline number. Isabella had been invited to speak for a few minutes about noticing and safety. She kept the talk short and concrete. She did not ask for applause. She handed out laminated checklists. After the talk, a woman in a paint-splattered sweatshirt came up and said quietly, "Thank you. My sister works in a cafe downtown." She'd never thought to keep a folder. The woman hugged Isabella, a brief gesture that felt like a small public absolution. Isabella, who was learning to live with her new public edges, felt oddly relieved. In the quieter hours, the consequences of publicity receded into smaller routines. Isabella and Dona Carmen instituted a weekly debrief for staff, safe space to share odd moments, to show footage that might be useful, to practice photographing in low light. They created an evidence kit tucked in a locked drawer: gloves, tamper-evident bags, an evidence tag, and a phone with a shielded account to upload footage to a cloud. It was all small and sensible. It was, in its own way, a community building. There were legal consequences for the accused beyond the verdict. The conviction carried with it the formal label of criminality and the bureaucratic consequences that attend it: restrictions, fines, and the beginning of a sentence. Appeals would challenge aspects of the trial, but the social mechanics of accountability had already done their work. The frightened envelopes no longer arrived at Isabella's door, and the worst of the harassing messages subsided into the background hum of spoiled internet conversations.
When the public heat cooled enough for an actual private life to reassert itself, Isabella began, slowly, to accept invitations to otherwise ordinary things. She had coffee with a colleague who now worked at a nonprofit, and she took the long walk home with a bakery bag and basil leaves sticking out of her tote. She learned to sleep without the light on for full nights. She learned to measure her breaths in the small way therapists teach. And one morning, months after the trial, she went to the park where Rodrigo's mother liked to sit in the sun under a spreading tree. Rodrigo's mother had grown more steady. She watched a child push a small red wagon and smiled. Isabella sat on a bench nearby, hands folded around a cup. She watched the ordinary, gentle choreography of people moving through a sunny hour. Rodrigo approached and sat next to her. He was quieter these days. They talked in short sentences, about pie, about the foundation,
about small procedural items that matter to people who run places where strangers gather, how to create an incident kit, the value of surveillance backups, the importance of well-documented witness statements. "Do you miss the restaurant yet?" he asked, and the question was simple, domestic, and real. "Some days," she said. "Mostly I miss the routine, the rhythm of it." He nodded. "You did the right thing," he said. But he said it without ceremony. It landed as a real human thing, not a headline. It had the gravity of someone who knew the cost of decisions. They sat a while, watching a little boy hand a paper airplane to an older woman who folded its wings and launched it without care. The small spectacle landed near a fountain, and another child laughed. It was an ordinary domestic neighboring, the kind of scene that, once you have tasted public intensity, tastes like a kind of safety. Isabella thought of the scrap of paper again, the small, humdrum object that had been the hinge of months of work. She thought of the chain of custody logs and the lab reports, and the courier signatures that had been small, precise acts of public procedure. She thought of the envelopes that had arrived at her door and the photographs. She thought of the nights of little sleep in the therapy that taught her not to shoulder the entire burden of a public event alone. She thought of a basil plat she tended in a window, and of the laminated checklists she now handed to trainees. Courage, she had learned, was the decision someone makes to notice and to record, even when it would be easier to step away. It was not loud. It was not cinematic. It was a series of small tasks executed with care. The foundation grew in modest ways. It set up a training schedule, a hotline, and an online resource page with checklists for businesses, and a list of local legal clinics that help employees facing intimidation. The nonprofit did not promise to solve everything, or to remove the costs of public involvement.
But it offered practical measures, templates for evidence logging, contact lists for local police units, and sample language for managers to use when the press arrived. Isabella became a spokesperson only rarely. She preferred the work of training and the quiet acts of helping others document the facts. When she did speak in public, she stayed to the script: notice, document, preserve, call. She reminded people that money and influence often try to turn a messy fact pattern into a narrative that protects power. Procedure, she said simply, helps truth speak. At the end of a long spring, on a warm afternoon, she returned to a newly installed bench at the park and watched a small plaza where children chased pigeons. Rodrigo's mother fed a little roll to a bird that hopped close and then flitted away. Isabella thought of the difference between spectacle and routine. She thought the system had worked imperfectly, but essentially. People had acted, scientists had analyzed, law had deliberated, and a jury had rendered a judgment. The world remained complicated, but the case had left behind small, practical improvements: better protocols at the restaurant, a training module shared in the community, and a hotline that offered someone the practical help they needed when they were the most vulnerable. Her phone buzzed. It was an email from the foundation with a modest invoice for a training session at a neighborhood cafe, payment that would make the coming month easier. She smiled the small smile people use for ordinary relief, and looked up to see a child tug on his mother's sleeve, asking to be lifted into a swing. Rodrigo's mother watched the play with a kind of contentment that felt in its own way like a verdict of life. Isabella rose, folded the basil's sleeve in her hand, and walked toward the little playground. She pushed a swing gently and then stepped back as the child laughed and a parent called thanks. The moment was small and simple and resonant with the ordinary work of living. When she bent to pick up the folder of laminated checklists from her bag, she noticed, on the bench beneath the tree, a scrap of paper someone had folded and left. Trash, perhaps, but folded with the kind of care that reminded her of the night months before. She picked it up, smiled at the minor echo, and put it in the evidence kit she carried, as if remembering taught you to prepare. The public story had closed its loud acts. Appeals would wind on, legal forms would be filed, paperwork would move through offices with the unglamorous regularity of civic life. The private consequences would not vanish, but the community had taken a few practical steps to be better prepared the next time. Isabella's life had been reshaped by attentive acts and ordinary help. She had learned to transform the cost she had borne into something that could protect others. Courage, in the end, was not the performance in a courtroom, nor the image in a headline.
It was the decision to notice a small motion, to record it, to hand that record to authorities, and to keep counting, even when counting is costly. Isabella kept counting. Logs, timestamps, photographs, names. Her work kept others safe. It kept her connected to an ordinary life that finally felt bearable. If you want to learn more about practical steps, how to preserve footage, how to document a scene, or how to find local resources for witness support, there are links and templates in the description below.
If this story matters to you, share it with someone who works in hospitality or community spaces. Small acts of preparation make it possible for truth to be heard.